They laughed at the man in uniform until the host grabbed the mic and said, "Where is he? We can't start without him." That moment stopped everything. The music, the murmurs, the clinking of glasses, it all went still. But just moments before, he was being humiliated at the door. Elijah Brooks wasn't just denied entry. He was dismissed, mocked. A security guard in a faded uniform, walking up the marble steps of the city's most exclusive Gala, uninvited in their eyes, invisible by their standards. A valet stepped forward. "Sorry, sir, deliveries are in the back." A woman in pearls turned to her husband. "Is he lost? Who let the help through the front?" He showed his invitation, creased, handwritten, real. They laughed. "Looks fake. No badge, no entry." Elijah didn't argue. He just stood there, silent, steady, almost used to this. And then, the music stopped. Spotlights shifted. From the podium, the host raised a hand, looked directly into the crowd, and asked, "Where is Elijah Brooks? I won't begin until he's here." Now, the same people who scoffed stared in stunned silence. Before we reveal the truth behind Elijah Brooks, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And if you believe stories like this matter, tap the like button, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more true-to-life tales that remind us what humanity really looks like. Because behind that uniform was a man whose story would unravel every assumption in the room. A man whose past tied into the very reason this gala existed. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting golden light across a long stretch of imported marble. Luxury sedans and polished limousines pulled up to the curb outside the grand, glass-fronted venue. Camera flashes exploded as local celebrities and high-profile donors emerged. Heels clicking, cufflinks gleaming, air thick with perfume and performance. This was the gala of the year, the kind of night where names mattered more than faces, and appearances were treated like currency. And then, he appeared. Elijah Brooks stepped out of the crowd, not from a car, but from the sidewalk. No escort, no chauffeur. Just a quiet man in a clean but faded security guard uniform. His black shoes scuffed from long hours on his feet, his hands tucked calmly behind his back. His name badge, E. Brooks, was barely visible under the lapel of his navy jacket. He walked with a certain stillness, like a man trained to scan every room, measure every threat, and say little. But here, no one saw that. Here, they only saw what he wasn't. A valet stepped forward too quickly, blocking his path before he could reach the steps. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said sharply, already annoyed. "Deliveries and support staff need to use the rear entrance. Guests are arriving." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not delivering anything," he replied evenly. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, an invitation, handwritten, creased at the edges. "I was invited." The valet didn't even glance at it. "Sure you were?" he said with a smirk, nodding to one of the security guards standing near the doors. Another guest, a tall man in a velvet blazer, sneered as he passed. "I guess they're just letting anyone in these days." Beside him, a woman in a sequined dress leaned closer and whispered, loud enough to be heard, "He must be lost, probably here for setup or cleanup." A ripple of laughter followed them as they ascended the stairs. Elijah remained still, his eyes flicking across the entrance like he was memorizing a crime scene. One of the door attendants reached out. "Sir, if you don't have credentials, real ones, we're going to have to ask you to leave." "I have an invitation," Elijah repeated. His voice didn't rise. His face didn't harden. But there was a quiet authority in the way he said it, like he was used to being obeyed, long before people learned to look down on men in uniforms. Still, no one listened. They didn't even look closely at the paper. What none of them knew, what none of them bothered to ask, was why the name on that invitation had been written with such care. Why the ink had bled slightly from being clutched in someone's trembling hand. Why the name Elijah Brooks mattered more than anyone else's on the list. But they didn't ask, because in their eyes he didn't matter. As the line of glittering guests moved past him, he took a slow step back. Not in retreat, but restraint. There was something in his eyes, something distant, almost haunted. Not by the gala, not by the insults, but by something deeper. Because for Elijah, this wasn't just another door being closed. It was a memory, one he'd carried for decades, of a time when uniforms didn't mean invisibility, but life and death. The gala was just beginning. But for Elijah Brooks, the night had already become something else entirely. Before Elijah Brooks ever stood on the marble steps of that gala, before the whispers and side eyes and shallow smiles, he had already lived a dozen lives. He was born to no one and raised by the system, passed from home to home, each one colder than the last. His name was written on folders, not family trees. His childhood was filled with plastic beds, hollow promises, and people who showed up just long enough to leave. He learned early that silence was safer than hope, that speaking up often led to punishment, and standing out made you a target. At 17, he signed the first paper that truly felt like a choice, a military enlistment form. He didn't just run away from foster homes, he ran toward something bigger. Structure, brotherhood, purpose. And in the military, he found it. In fact, he thrived, quietly, steadily, brilliantly. Elijah wasn't the loudest in the barracks. He wasn't the guy cracking jokes or bragging about drills, but when things got serious, when chaos broke loose, he was the man others instinctively followed. He rose through the ranks with precision and purpose, earning the respect of those around him, even if he never demanded it. His record was clean. His judgment was sharp. And when it mattered most, he led a mission that would define his legacy. 18 civilians, trapped behind enemy lines in a collapsing compound. The mission was deemed a lost cause. High risk, low chance of success. But Elijah volunteered anyway, not because he was reckless, but because he'd once been the one no one came back for. Under heavy fire, he coordinated a daring extraction, crawled through debris, shielded a child with his own body, radioed support with a fractured shoulder, got everyone out, every last one. That day earned him a medal, but it also cost him something deeper. On the return flight, he sat in silence while others cheered. The weight of survival wasn't something he wore proudly. It sat in his bones. The images never left, and neither did the sound of one teammate's final breath in his arms. The military offered therapy. He declined. They offered public recognition. He refused. Eventually, he took an early retirement, honorably discharged, silently broken. He didn't cash in on his story. He didn't do interviews or write a book. He returned to a quiet life in a quiet city where no one knew his name. He became a security guard at a local school, not because it paid well, but because it meant he could still protect something. The kids didn't know his past. They just called him Mr. Brooks. To them, he was the calm man who stood outside the cafeteria, the one who helped carry heavy backpacks, stopped fights before they started, and could diffuse tension with a single look. And every weekend he volunteered at the community center, working with boys who reminded him of himself, angry, overlooked, uncertain. He taught them discipline, respect, accountability, not with force but with presence. Elijah didn't need a spotlight. He didn't crave validation. He had been trained to endure. That was his superpower. He didn't speak about the war because he didn't want pity. He didn't show his medals because he believed real honor wasn't worn. It was lived. He stood guard because no one had ever stood guard for him. Everything he did, every quiet act of service, every watchful gaze, was his way of keeping the world just a little bit safer for someone else. By the time he received the invitation to the gala, he had already filed it away in his heart as a mystery. No name on the sender. No explanation, just a note. Your presence would mean everything. Please come. He almost didn't. But something in the handwriting, something about the care in the lettering, felt familiar. He pressed the paper against his chest, took a breath, and showed up. Not for glory, not for applause, but because someone had finally remembered him. Or so he hoped. Inside the ballroom, everything sparkled, from the chandelier crystals above to the champagne bubbling in delicate flutes below. Laughter danced in the air. A soft jazz trio played in the background as guests clinked glasses and admired their own reflections in the gilded mirrors. The banners overhead read, "Champions of the Community, honoring those who serve in silence." And yet, outside those same doors stood a man the community had forgotten. Elijah Brooks remained near the entrance, not defiant, not angry, simply present, unmoving. He wasn't looking for validation. He was waiting to understand why someone invited him to a place that didn't want him. The usher, who had initially dismissed him, had moved on to welcome other guests, but now she kept glancing back at him, as if unsure whether he was a threat, a mistake, or a mystery yet to be explained. He noticed something. A name placard on the check-in table. It read, "Reserved for founding contributors." He stared at it longer than necessary, not because it applied to him, but because, years ago, something similar had. Across the walkway, a few younger guests took notice of Elijah and began quietly recording him on their phones. "Is he lost?" one whispered. "Maybe he's here to stop someone," another joked. "He looks intense." Their eyes scanned his uniform but not his face. To them, he was scenery, background detail in their curated night. But one person did see him. A young girl, barely in her teens, broke away from the crowd and walked up to him, her heels slightly too big, her dress hem brushing the tops of her sneakers. "Mr. Brooks?" she said. Elijah looked down, surprised. It took him a moment to recognize her out of her school clothes. But then it clicked. Ava, 8th grade. The one who used to sit alone during recess, scribbling in her notebook. The one he once walked home after she'd been shoved against a locker and said nothing to anyone but him. "You remember me?" she asked, her voice tentative. He nodded. "Of course I do." "My mom and I are guests tonight," she said proudly. "She got a community award last year. I told her about you. I hoped you'd come." Ava's smile faded as she looked toward the entrance. "They didn't let you in, did they?" Elijah offered a soft shrug. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Not to her. She turned to the check-in table and raised her voice slightly. "Excuse me, this man." The usher cut her off without looking up. "Miss, please return to your party." Ava's mouth opened to protest, but Elijah gently touched her shoulder. "It's all right," he said again. He wasn't trying to be noble. He was used to it. This kind of quiet erasure. It was familiar. Just then, one of the hotel managers approached the usher, whispered something and nodded in Elijah's direction. A ripple of unease passed through them. The usher frowned, now unsure. Elijah glanced toward the ballroom entrance one last time. He didn't expect anything, but he still wondered, why invite him here at all if no one was going to acknowledge it? And then, the music stopped. Abruptly, mid-note. The soft hum of the Gala went still. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. A spotlight turned on overhead, illuminating the stage. A man stood behind the podium. Tall, impeccably dressed, clearly the host. He stepped up to the microphone, but didn't speak right away. Instead, he scanned the room, as if searching for something, or someone. Finally, his voice rang out through the speaker system. "Before we begin tonight, I need to ask something." The audience turned toward him. "Is Elijah Brooks in the building?" Silence. People looked at each other. The name didn't ring a bell, but the tone in the host's voice silenced any murmur of laughter. The host continued, firmer now. "We are not starting until he's here." Gasps fluttered across the room. The hotel staff at the check-in table looked like they'd swallowed their tongues. The security guard stopped mid-stride. Even Ava's mother turned in surprise. And just outside the entrance, under the same lights that had once exposed his invisibility, Elijah Brooks stood motionless, his expression unreadable. He didn't move. Not yet. He was still trying to understand how a room full of people who barely gave him a glance were now frozen by the mention of his name. The host's voice still echoed through the ballroom. "We don't begin until Elijah Brooks is here." Silence followed, sharp and loaded, the kind that makes people feel exposed, like the truth had just pulled up a chair beside them. Heads turned, necks craned. Whispers fluttered like falling feathers across the room. "Who is Elijah Brooks? Is that the man outside? Wait, is he someone important?" Suddenly, the man everyone ignored was all they could talk about. Outside, the tension shifted visibly. The same usher who had denied him minutes earlier was now rushing to the door with shaky hands, trying to fix her tone. Her voice went high and polite, overly sweet. "Mr. Brooks, I'm terribly sorry for the misunderstanding. We must have made an error at check-in. Please, right this way." A nearby valet scrambled to wipe imaginary dust from Elijah's jacket. One of the hotel managers offered him a bottled water with both hands, like it was a peace offering. For a moment, Elijah said nothing. He stood in place, calm, still, unreadable. Not angry, not triumphant. Just quietly watching everyone unravel around him. The same people who wouldn't let him in were now rushing to escort him like royalty. But Elijah didn't move. He looked up at the building, looked around at the faces. Not the wealthy guests, not the clumsy staff. He looked at Ava, the young girl still standing to the side, watching all of this unfold with wide eyes. And then he looked back at the usher. "I was here the whole time," he said softly. She nodded awkwardly, but there was nowhere to hide. Inside the ballroom, a guest whispered, "Why didn't he say who he was?" A woman nearby answered, barely above a whisper, "He shouldn't have to. Not with fanfare, not with revenge." He walked through the same doors that had been blocked moments ago, with a heavy kind of grace. The ballroom changed the moment he entered. The guests parted like the sea, unsure whether to look at him or away. He didn't glance at the decor or the lights or the awards lined neatly across the stage. His eyes were searching for only one person, the host, and the host was waiting. The lights dim slightly as the host steps forward again. His voice is quieter now, not the voice of a businessman or a public figure, but of a boy. "I was 10, he began, trapped under concrete, lungs full of smoke, thinking that was going to be my last breath." The audience held still. It was a war zone. Everyone said help wasn't coming. And then, through the rubble, a man lifted me out, carried me like I weighed nothing, told me to breathe, told me I was going to be okay. He looked out into the room, and his eyes met Elijah's. That man was Elijah Brooks. A quiet gasp moved through the crowd. The host continued. "He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't stay for a photo. I didn't even know his name until years later when I went searching for him." He gestured to the room. "Everything you see tonight, this company, this event, this mission to serve people, was inspired by the man who saved my life before I ever had one." He turned fully toward Elijah. "I learned strength from watching your courage. I built my future by following your example, and I owe you everything." At the edge of the crowd, Ava smiled up at her mom. She whispered, "See? That's who he is." Elijah stood still, his hands gently folded in front of him. No fist, no ego, just quiet weight. The people who had ignored him minutes ago now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, but respect. Earned, not revealed. The emotional tide had shifted, but the storm of truth was just beginning to wash over the room. The room remained silent, suspended in the weight of the host's words. "He saved my life before I ever had one." The crowd that once whispered now waited, still, humbled, and unsure of what came next. The host stepped down from the stage, walked slowly through the parting crowd, and approached Elijah with a reverence that said more than any speech ever could. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, not to reveal a medal, but something far more symbolic. A brass pin, worn, a bit faded, engraved with the initials of a foundation every guest in the room had seen on the banner tonight. The BEAR initiative: bravery, empathy, accountability, resilience. The host raised the pin for all to see, then looked out at the crowd. "There's one more thing most of you don't know," he said. "This foundation, this entire organization you've supported tonight, didn't begin with me." He turned to Elijah. "It began with him." Gasps echoed around the room. Even the press in the corner stopped clicking their shutters. Elijah Brooks was one of the original co-founders of the BEAR initiative, the host continued. He built it long before there was a boardroom, long before there was a stage or donor list or black tie gala. The host's voice softened. But he stepped away, not for scandal, not for fame, but because he believed his work wasn't in the spotlight, it was in the shadows, among the kids no one listened to, among the streets no one walked anymore. He walked away from recognition to walk toward real people. A silence fell over the room again, but this one was different. This one was reverent. The host turned toward the projector behind the stage and gave a nod. Photos appeared on the massive screen, grainy, black and white shots of Elijah, younger, standing beside soldiers, helping children, sitting with veterans, speaking at forgotten town halls, sweeping a school hallway at dawn, unseen until now. The host returned to the mic, voice steady but charged with emotion. "Every dollar donated tonight, Every name on the list, every chair filled in this room, it wasn't to honor CEOs or investors. He paused. It was to honor those who stand between chaos and peace. To honor the people who show up without needing to be seen. He pointed toward Elijah. Every donation tonight was made in his name. A stunned murmur rolled through the guests. You didn't come here to celebrate yourselves, he added. You came to remember someone you never knew was carrying this city on his shoulders. He didn't ask for it. He didn't walk to the stage. The host brought it to him. No spotlight, no music, just quiet hands placing the mic into his. Elijah looked out across the room, not with pride, but with clarity. He took one breath, let the silence hold, and said, "The world doesn't need more applause. It needs more people who show up for others when no one's watching." That was it. No speech, no summary, no humble deflection, just the truth. The kind of truth that hung in the air long after the microphone was returned. Why do we ignore quiet greatness until it's convenient to remember it? Tonight, that question didn't just float. It hit everyone in the room like a mirror. Because the very people who had spent their lives chasing recognition had just been reminded what real legacy looks like. A man who built something meaningful, then walked away from the spotlight to protect it. The ballroom had never been quieter. Not from awkwardness, but respect. No standing ovation, no confetti, no forced applause, just the weight of 100 people realizing they'd nearly stepped over a man who built the ground they stood on. As the crowd slowly began to shift, the host made one final announcement. He gestured toward the projection screen behind him. Another photo appeared, not of Elijah this time, but of a young girl. Ava, her face lit by a school hallway light, clutching a sketchbook in her arms. This, the host said gently, is the kind of person Elijah shows up for. He turned to her in the audience, her small frame still beside her mother, unsure of what to do with the attention. We'd like to announce the very first Elijah Brooks Legacy Scholarship, awarded to Ava Reed for courage, for voice, for seeing what most adults missed. Gasps. Then genuine applause, the kind that starts small and spreads from the soul. Ava's mother cried softly as her daughter looked up at Elijah, eyes wide with disbelief, as if her childhood had just been rewritten in real time. Elijah offered her a small, firm nod. That was all, and it was everything. Elsewhere in the room, the valet from earlier now stood stiffly by the coat racks, too ashamed to make eye contact. The usher who turned Elijah away sat silently near the wall, her hands clasped, eyes down. But there were no lectures, no call-outs, no revenge, only humility. They weren't punished, they were simply reminded. That respect is not something you give once a name becomes familiar. It's something you offer the moment a soul stands before you. As the night wound down, Elijah Brooks slipped away, not through the grand exit, not down the velvet stairs, but through the back service hallway, the same one he used every day at the school. He walked alone, hands in his pockets, the weight of the moment already fading behind him. Not because it didn't matter, but because for him it had never been about the moment. Night fell over the city, and miles away from the ballroom, beneath a flickering security light outside a quiet public school, Elijah Brooks stood once again, back at his post. The same old uniform, the same quiet breath. He glanced up at the stars, then back toward the entrance doors. The hallways were dark, the playground is empty. Still, he stood guard, because someone had to, because someone always should. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear name tags, some carry keys instead of titles, and sometimes the person you ignored built the very house you now celebrate in. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Like it. Leave a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest. And most importantly, remember the Elijahs in your own life. Subscribe for more real stories that honor the quiet heroes among us.